It's Friday, and welcome to yet another edition of the Zogby Report, real and unscripted. We're kind of at a pivotal moment here because we have the end of a presidency and a president who's already issued his farewell. And as we're in transition to a week from now, we'll have a new president. And so I thought today, Jared, what we would do is put some final touches on the Biden presidency, and then, like everybody else, make the transition and talk about prospects for the Trump presidency. How's that sound to you?
That sounds appropriate.
Okay, good. So let's start with Biden. I know that maybe most people out there may not be baseball fans, but I want to begin with a baseball parable anyway, because I think it has a larger story. The greatest winning pitcher, left-handed pitcher in Major League history, is a fellow by the name of Warren Spahn. He was huge when I was a kid in the 50s and early 60s, won more games, lots of strikeouts, championship rings, obvious choice for the Hall of Fame. But the thing that was striking to me about Warren Spahn was that he did not know when to give it up. Here he had compiled all these great numbers. He was in his mid-40s, and yet his mantra was, I can still pitch. I can still pitch. I can still play. And he was traded from his longtime team, the Braves, Boston, then Milwaukee, then to the New York Mets and the San Francisco Giants, and he was not doing well. And so he even tried, by this time, as I recall, age of 46, 47, pitching in the very low minor leagues, and still with this belief, I can still pitch, but now he's getting shelled, meaning 17, 18-year-olds fresh out of high school are hitting him, hitting home runs off of him. He's a disaster. And the feeling then was that he was going to destroy his entire legacy, and that the only thing people will ever talk about concerning Warren Spahn was the fact that he just did not know when to quit. So I looked up Warren Spahn. I did actually a couple of months ago, and then I did just prior to this podcast. And what I discovered was that there was no mention of hanging around too long at all. I mean, there were these fleeting kinds of abstract references to him still pitching, but, no commentary and certainly nothing demeaning about it. And I think that brings us to Joe Biden. I have very strong feelings, as you know, about Gaza. Not that Gaza was a mistake. It was a catastrophe. And it was like George W. Bush before him in Iraq. It was a gratuitous, a self-imposed wrong thing to do, that it was immoral, cost lives, it was genocidal, and President Biden is the deputy butcher of the people of Gaza because of his ongoing support for Israel, with a possible hostage deal now notwithstanding. It's the year and a half plus that counts for me. With that said, and that in itself hurting his legacy, I still believe that Joe Biden will be treated kindly by historians for his first year and a half in office, on infrastructure, on saving the economy, on putting spending money in people's hands, causing inflation, but then dealing with inflation, and so many other domestic initiatives that will put him on the level of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and for that matter, Lyndon Johnson. And while I mention Lyndon Johnson, I remember the days when Johnson was considered in the 20s somewhere in the ranking of U.S. presidents. And of course, at that point in time, there had been only 36 presidents. So he was in the lower third. And now we see Johnson bordering on the top 10 for his domestic initiatives and programs, and a mention, obviously, of the disastrous war in Vietnam, but almost a willingness to give Johnson a pass on Vietnam because of what he was able to do with the war on poverty, the Great Society, Medicare and Medicaid, and so on. So my judgment is that not that Joe Biden will reach the top 10, and probably in pretty short order, but he started his first rating was at about 14. He'll slide a little bit, but he'll be back among the top 15 presidents, even with these disasters and even with that Warren Spahn like experience of not knowing when to quit, hubris, arrogance, narcissism. There you go. My take on Joe Biden still makes it into the Hall of Fame, like Warren Spahn.
So, as you classically say on this podcast, I disagree. But I will give you this. No, honestly, I think people who disagree with you would instantly charge you with partisanship. But what I listened to, I did not hear partisanship. I believe that your methodology is summed up by looking at, by evaluating and analyzing how presidential historians rank presidents and how with each generation or through generations, those change. And that is that's a very objective basis. And that was what I heard in your assessment. And so for that, I say that was not partisan. The first thing I would say is that the phenomenon of ranking presidential historians, I think, is a modern phenomenon. I don't think that this was a thing that was going on in the late 19th century. I don't think it was a thing that was going on at the turn of the century. To my understanding, this is born of the last 50, 60, 70 years, where you get your professors, whether they're from Duke, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, very top-notch schools, very good schools, and they look at the presidency and they talk about who's number one and who's the best. And it's kind of like, for American historian geeks, it's kind of like what sports statistics is for sports fans. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, what's different with sports is that those measurements are fixed. I think we're on the cusp of a new era, of a new zeitgeist, of a new way of looking at things, as what happens with history when revisionism and generations move on. And so I think there could be a total break with how we assess presidents. And so, I think future historians, presidential historians, are probably going to look different than this crop of who've been doing this for 10, 20, 30 years. But with that said, let's try and move beyond partisanship in politics in my assessment, because if you ask Republican-leaning or Republican individuals now, the first thing they're going to talk about inevitably is either Afghanistan and the failure of exiting Afghanistan. That's very commonplace. They will talk about inflation. That's very commonplace. You, of course, will also hear about immigration. And just looking at the statistics, if you look at the Department of Homeland Security and you look at the previous few administrations and the increase of incidents, border incidents. And of course, liberals will talk about Gaza. I think moderates and independents will talk about the cost of living, the standard of living, and how under his presidency, maybe a majority of people would say this. They would cite that a class of people became even more uber wealthy, to the likes of which history has never seen, and most people got poorer. And that happened on Biden's time But what I want to look at that I think will be the defining feature of Joe Biden's legacy and will prevent him from being in, let's say, the top 20 or top 15, and probably in the lower rankings of maybe even the lowest 10 or the lowest 15, was the age factor. But let's cut to the chase. The wide recognition that Biden was in decline from the very beginning, and we are now learning that journalists were well aware of this, and there was a cloud of a tense feeling that you knew if you were a journalist, you were not to talk about this, you were not to cover this, and so it was hidden. And I think that that is the defining feature, unfortunately, for President Joe Biden, was that when he got into office, his state of we're not even talking about the DSM-4 from the American Psychological Association. We're not getting into narcissism and different pathologies. We're talking about actual cognitive decline. And for that, when we realize this and we learn about this, we know that he wasn't really the decision maker. He couldn't have been the decision maker, and I think that's a major stain, and that prevents him from having a mid or high tier ranking.
Okay, and I think all that's fair. And just a few bullet points, okay, before we move on to Trump. One is that the presidential rankings by historians began under Arthur Schlesinger Sr. And it was, revived under Arthur Schlesinger Jr., both of whom were left of center. Many historians, political scientists, are left of center. In recent years, there's been an effort to bring in more conservatives and to balance things off, even to the point where the Wall Street Journal has done its own rankings, and C-SPAN has done its own rankings with even more balance, among the ideologies of historians. That's number one. Number two are the changes that we've seen. So real quick, Harry Truman left office with the lowest approval ratings of any president in American history, and is now regarded as the sixth or seventh greatest president. And that, of course, with the atomic bomb. I remember Dwight Eisenhower at 21 in rankings, and now he's right behind Theodore Roosevelt, number 5, competing with Jefferson, 5 or 6. I've seen Richard Nixon go from dead last in the immediate aftermath of Watergate to a much greater appreciation for the foreign policy genius that was Nixon. And that's not a moral or ideological judgment on my part. It's the fact that he was a very smart president. Bill Clinton, 8 years of peace and prosperity. He gets more credit for it than the low rankings of Bill Clinton for moral example and moral leadership. So that's kind of where, as you point out, where I'm coming from. Let's take a look at Trump. And I'm just going to take a stab at it because he's been president before. And the first round did not fare well with historians. He's either dead last, or he might say thank you, Jimmy Buchanan and Franklin Pierce, for holding up the bottom for me, just above them at the very bottom. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I don't know that he expected to win in 2016. So I don't know that there was really an agenda. And a lot of his piecing together of an administration was helter-skelter. Whoever was available to say yes and willing to hang on for a few months kind of defined his presidency, as did some outrageous statements about COVID, about blaming Joe Biden for the terrible withdrawal in Afghanistan, and yet this was the policy that Donald Trump had signed off on. And then, of course, there is the whole moral and legal question surrounding Donald Trump. This time around is an opportunity for redemption. There seems to be much more clarity coming from Donald Trump in terms of who he wants to appoint, why he wants to appoint them. He has, I'm going to put it in quotes, a majority in the House of Representatives. We'll have to see. And a good majority in the Senate, where a number of those appointments are going to come from. And he looks to be someone with a clear agenda. On the other hand, what may define Joe Biden's presidency ultimately, and we'll have to see, is the same thing that is in the top three in defining Dwight Eisenhower's presidency, which is his farewell and his warning about the military-industrial complex. And I can't help but look at Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Cook and so on, and see, is this a billionaires club? Is this really an oligarchy? Let's see if, in many ways, Donald Trump's second term is defined by that. Prospects are not good for Donald Trump.
And for the first 100 days, you're not talking about future rankings, or are you?
No, not the first 100 days. We're going to have to, nobody ranks the first 100 days until the second year in office.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess I'll just go in short order. I think Trump knew he could win. Trump seems like the type of person, the type of personality that walks into a room and can sniff fear. And maybe it wasn't fear when he entered the political arena in 2015 and 2016, but it was confidence and the way he could project it and the way that he could get under people's skin. And I think as soon as he saw that, and he executed that with, one Republican candidate after the other, Jeb Bush, Rubio, I think he knew, okay, I'm knocking these guys off. I think I can win. I think he knew he could win fairly quickly, and maybe even before. We also have to remember that in 2020, COVID broke out at the time a campaign started. Arguably the first week or the first weeks, that grueling process of running for re-election and an emergency, a global emergency. So that puts some context. But I want to jump straight to Biden's farewell. If I compare it to Eisenhower did give us a wonderful gift in that farewell speech, warning us of the encroaching dangers of the military-industrial technological complex that, as he said, would rob the future bright minds of scientists and engineers for the cause of war and empire. He didn't use those terms, but that's what he was talking about. And the loss of individual liberties at home. But there wasn't something partisan in that warning. My assessment of that speech is he was genuinely concerned, and that it wasn't because a young Kennedy, JFK, was taking office that Eisenhower felt the need to push that out. I have a strong sense that Biden's, part two of that warning is more partisan, because we know the Biden administration was very well surrounded by Silicon Valley, and we know that Silicon Valley, as Mark Zuckerberg revealed, that the executive branch, more specifically the White House, and the intelligence agencies were pushing him and giving the directions on what to do about misinformation and disinformation, not just with COVID, but even politics in general, other issues. And so it is quite hypocritical and troubling that Biden makes that warning, but it really only looks like it's directed at people like Musk and the recent coming out of Zuckerberg in favor of Trump. It is wrapped up more in partisanship, I believe, than it is in genuine concern, because there is a strong sense of hypocrisy to it, given the level of coordination between Silicon Valley and the White House under Biden.
Once again, we see the world from two different angles, but we do talk about it gently, don't we?
Always.
Okay, I can't argue with you because I think that it's legitimate. Everything you're saying is legitimate. We'll just have to see how it plays out. But next week, of course, we're going to talk about the inauguration and the laying out of goals. And we'll take it from there. We'll have this podcast will have 4 years of job security.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Have a good week.
You too.
All right. Take care.